Okay, so I think we're all here. So for everyone who's here, welcome to the second webinar in the series from Bergin and Garfield Handbook. So for those folk who didn't come to the first one, just to explain that this is a collaboration between SPR, CEPI, and Division 29, Psychotherapy. Okay, so it's sort of open to a wider audience than as usually be the case for SPR webinars. Just to explain, we've had a little chat previously. I was a bit concerned that this could either be a total snafu in the sense of having this on Easter Monday, because I never quite knew when Easter Monday was. But anyway, it turns out that quite a few people have registered. So we're sort of working on the basis that actually after a sort of a holiday period, everyone will want a bit of intellectual exercise, and this is exactly what you've all been waiting for. So with that kind of preface, I'd like to welcome Simon Goldberg, who is assistant professor at Wisconsin-Madison, and Scott Baldwin from BYU. And just to say that I've been a great fan of both Simon and Scott, different reasons, but they contributed the second chapter to the handbook. In fact, we invited Scott because of his expertise in statistical analysis and methodology, second to none in many people's views and mine. And he invited Simon to join him, in his words, if I remember this correctly, because of his sort of teaching expertise in conveying ideas, etc. Anyway, it turned out to be a wonderful chapter. So if anyone has not got the handbook, boo-hoo, you should do. And certainly you should read their chapter. It's wonderful. So they were given a platform either to present their chapter or any part of it. And what they've chosen is to talk to the title, What Do Range Restriction, Statistical Power, and Pre-Registration Have to Do with My Data? Okay, the microphone's all yours.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Michael. Are we coming through okay? People can hear us?
Wonderful.
All right. And maybe one of our hopes for this, we were chatting about this before, we have 32 slides and not quite 60 minutes left. So hopefully there will be lots of opportunity for discussion and questions. And we have some questions at the end, in particular related to pre-registration that we'd like your all's input in. But in the spirit of getting folks involved, if people could just put in the chat where they're calling in from so we can get a sense of who's all here, that would be wonderful. Assuming the chat is unmuted. All right, awesome. So I think Argentina, Vancouver, wow. We really are from all over the world. It's really true.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
International crew. Fantastic. And great to see a lot of friends on the call too from all over the world. Okay, wonderful. Well, welcome all of you. Thanks for joining us. So why are you here? Why are we here? We think that all of us will agree that methods are important. They're really the bedrock of the work that we do. We think, as Michael said, if you're coming on an Easter Monday for some intellectual stimulation, maybe you agree that methods are fun, and this is a fun part of our job as psychotherapy researchers, and also that methods are continually evolving, and this isn't something that you learn in graduate school and then you're set for the rest of your career, but kind of requires we should have methods CEUs. Maybe these are our method CEUs to keep us fresh. I know working with Scott always does that for me. As Michael mentioned, if you haven't gotten the handbook, boo-hoo, you should. It's wonderful. There are many, many chapters on many, many topics. And with Scott's guidance, we wrote our attempt at kind of capturing many of the methods that we use regularly in psychotherapy research as kind of a one-stop shop. This isn't an in-depth review of any particular method, but we really hoped it would cover a lot of methods that we might encounter in our work and our reading of the literature. And we'll try to do justice to some of that. This is kind of our attempted methods flight today. Well, we'll give you a little sampler platter of some of the methods in the handbook. Scott, anything you want to add by way of intro?
Yeah, just that we tried to highlight, and for today, some things that we think are useful talking points for areas we can improve as a discipline or as a field. And then I guess the other part is that we're speaking primary or only to quantitative methods in this chapter as well as today. So
Yep, thank you. And I think, was there a chapter on qualitative methods in the handbook?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, I thought there was. Yeah. So we're not qualified to speak to that. So maybe there'll be another webinar on that coming up.
Absolutely. There will be.
Okay. So if measurement or if methods are the foundation in a way of the work that we do, measurement is really an important brick in that foundation. And two key aspects of that, which I'm sure at least all of the names that I recognized on the call, I know folks are familiar with, are reliability and validity. And just at a high level, we can think of reliability as the degree to which a measure is free from measurement error and is, for that reason, consistent in the measurements that it provides. So in the kind of classic bullseyes that are used to differentiate between reliability and validity, we can see that measures that aren't reliable, can you all see my cursor? You probably can't.
Yes, we can.
you can.
Oh, okay, wonderful. So you can see these X's are kind of scattered wide around the bullseye. They're not clustered around the bullseye. So this is a measure that's not reliable, nor is it valid. And valid meaning a measure measures what we think it should measure, the kind of definition of construct validity, but captures also convergent and discriminant validity, the degree to which a measure correlates with things that we think it should and doesn't correlate with things that we shouldn't. And we can think of that as kind of being centered around the bullseye. So reliability is the spread of these measures, whether there's a lot of error in the measurement or whether they're kind of clustered around a particular area, as you see here. And then validity is the degree to which it's centered on the bullseye. So here we have validity, where if you took the average, the point in the middle of all of those X's, you'd see, okay, it's there in the bullseye, but the measures have quite a bit of error in them. And of course, what we hope for in our measures is that they're both reliable and valid and are giving us a really pure measurement of whatever construct we're interested in. And one element of validity that's getting more conversation in the literature of late, of course, is cultural validity and the degree to which measures are valid and reliable across various cultural groups. So, of course, we have a lot of work to do in that area, but is one element of validity that we wanted to highlight today. Scott, anything to add about this fundamental piece?
I think one thing that's particularly interesting to think about as psychotherapy researchers, especially if you're focused on, well, it's true whether it's process or outcome, but and that's the idea of I don't know if I'm using the term right, but I believe you kind of think of the psychology of using the measure. So if you're the respondent, let's say it's a self-report measure of outcome. So a common one used around BYU is the OQ45. And if you look at the questions, they require, I would argue they require some thought for the person to make appropriate discriminations, to accurately reflect upon their experience and that sort of thing. But there's some interesting research done about 10 years ago at our counseling center just on the use of as the clients came in, how did they use the OQ45 and what did they do? And what's interesting is how rapidly they would answer all the questions, especially after they'd done it a few times, often not giving it a whole lot of thought. And I just think it's just a key question I think we need to ask ourselves pretty regularly, is how well are people actually answering these questions in a way that gives us the information that we think that it is. And Simon, if you want to go on to the next one.
Yeah.
Where that sometimes comes into play is with an issue of range restriction. And so one of the areas that I've done some research in that I'm pretty interested in is in the working alliance. And one of the things I started to notice in the data sets I was working with was a lot of the alliance. And most of the measure I've used the most is the working alliance inventory. Each item ranges from 1 to 7. And what we were noticing is that almost all the respondents had average scores across all the items in the 5 to 7 range, meaning almost no one was reporting 1 through 4. If you think about what that could mean, so if you think about the alliance, if you assume that the working alliance measure is indeed doing its job correctly in that case, then that's suggesting there really aren't any really poor relationships or working alliances in this case amongst the sample. It's also possible that the measure itself is just not discriminating well enough. So it's answering questions asking questions that aren't getting sufficiently differentiating amongst people. And I think one of the questions we then have is, to what extent is that impacting our coefficients and things that the relationships we're looking at? So in the chapter, one thing we did is we performed a simulation, and in the interest of time, I won't go through a lot of the details, but it's basically comparing what if you saw the whole range of like 1 through 7 versus, and let's say that's actually what's going on, is there really are a lot of differences amongst like in a population, there really are a lot of relationship differences in psychotherapy dyads. But then we looked at what would happen if our measure only captures the top end. And what you find is that if the true correlation is 0.5, then if you restrict the range, at best, you're going to see an average of 0.2. And then they're going to be highly variable. So it adds a lot of noise into your estimates. So from one study to the next, you're just going to see them bouncing around a lot more than if you're seeing the whole range of things. And so it's something to pay pretty close attention to. And I think it's interesting. It's hard to know whether that's a measure problem or a construct problem or some combination of the two. Anyway, it's just something to think about. You see, Jock asked if, how do we know if something is actually restricted? And there's no absolute cutoff. I think it would be a combination of what we expect. So theoretically, what would we expect to be happening? So in the case of a working alliance, if we're thinking that in our sample, there should be ruptured alliances and we should be picking those up, and that's going to mean a low score on the measure, then we should be seeing some portion of that. And then I think it's just a question of how much, what the population distribution should look like. Should it look skewed, in which case our measure is doing exactly what we think it is? And then we might need to think of a different statistical approach to deal with a more skewed distribution. Or anyway, so that I think it's just sort of a combination of theory and practical application would help us define when it's restricted versus not. And Bob DeRubis made this point in great detail in a really good paper that describes sort of the implications for process research generally. So,
awesome. And thank you, Jock, for the question. Great question. Okay, so many of us and many of the people on this call, in fact, are involved in figuring out ways to innovate our measures. So to move beyond merely self-report measures or self-report measures of the alliance, for example, that we know have range restriction and other issues with them. And some of the motivation for this is making our measures more efficient and less burdensome to participants, seeing if we can capture constructs that have been missing from measures that we're gathering, and then figuring out ways to integrate these measures into routine care. And Scott's point with the OQ45 is an example of that, where if we have concerns about how people are responding when they're doing this weekly in therapy, are there other approaches that we can use to still capture some of what we're intending to capture with the measure, but in a way that's less burdensome to patients and potentially more valid ultimately for decision making. So these are just a few kind of high-level things that we mention in the chapter that we wanted to bookmark today. One is the use of item response theory to develop computer adaptive tests. So I know in our group, we've been using the PROMIS measures a lot that have computer adaptive versions. They have measures of depression and anxiety, measures of meaning in life. There's a PROMIS sleep measure, and they can be as short as 4 items, but because of their use of item response theory, they're able to include items that contain more information. So the actual items that someone's given are based on their prior responses. So that's I think a really neat measure innovation that's happening and can at least make measures less burdensome and potentially more sensitive. Another innovation is the use of ecological momentary assessment, which can capture experiences in the context of daily life. They're not as vulnerable to retrospective biases, which we know can be an issue with measures like the OQ45 or PHQ-9 and so forth. Of course, there's a lot of work happening around passive sensing and personal sensing using data gathered from smartphones, for example, accelerometry, GPS, those sorts of things can potentially provide signal related to mental health and well-being. And then, of course, many of the observer ratings that we've been using for decades in psychotherapy research, but are potentially becoming more market ready through machine learning based scoring. So I know Zach Immel's group is doing a lot of that with their Listen platform. I know others have done that. We've done some work with the FIS for that, and others have done work with other observer rated measures as well. So that's one of those innovations, kind of pairing this measurement method with new statistical models and advances in computer science that really could make these something that we could actually have in our clinics. And of course, there's a wide variety of physiological measures, motion, biological measures that folks are exploring as well, which are super exciting. And we just wanted to put a bookmark on the special issue that Sigal and Fabian edited a few years back in JCP that has a lot of great examples of that. Scott, anything to add here?
I think with the machine learning bit, I think one of the interesting things, just to kind of connect it up to the range restriction thing, is I think for some of the processes we might be interested in, even basic things like the relationship between a therapist and a client, often requires a pretty big scope, meaning you got to have lots of sessions and lots of therapists and that sort of thing. And one of the cool things about something where it can be a little bit more automated to at least detect certain aspects of the relationship, I think it affords a lot of promise. And Zach Immel just has shared just some interesting little tidbits from, they have some recordings from the, in the United States, there's now an emergency, it's 311, but it's an emergency call number. You can call it for a suicide support, essentially. And so they have some calls from that, and it's just wild, the variety of responses you get. You have some that just look like model empathy and support and those sorts of things, to just sort of shaming and just pretty miserable interpersonal style sorts of things. And again, I think the machine-based learning stuff allows us to do some things that maybe we wouldn't be able to do it just takes too much human power to do it otherwise.
And I know, Scott, we've talked about you could build, in theory, if you had enough data, you could build those models using observer ratings or other, having a sample that's less skewed in some way, and kind of build models that potentially would be able to capture a wider range and not be as sensitive to the rater bias too. Yeah. All right. So measurement innovations, and yeah, lots of you again are leading that work.
Okay, so obviously a big part of psychotherapy research is evaluating treatment packages. And by treatment packages here, I'm referring to things like cognitive therapy or acceptance commitment therapy, that sort of thing, where there's some sort of treatment delivered, and typically in a randomized trial. It's usually considered, the randomized trial is usually considered the gold standard for causal inference, that whatever we did in that treatment produced the effects that we observed. There are kind of two, most of psychotherapy research history and most still done are what are sometimes referred to as superiority trials. And that's just probably what you're used to, which is two or more treatments are compared to one another, and you compare it to a null hypothesis that says they're equal. Then you also have these non-inferiority trials or equivalence trials, where it flips that a bit. And basically, the assumption is that they are going to be equivalent, and then you're powering it and testing to see whether there's non-equivalence in the study. That lots of the research, methodological research in that area comes from medicine and psychopharmacology or pharmacology research. It's pretty interesting, and I think a lot of to the extent that we need to keep doing those kinds of treatment trials in psychotherapy research, we might want to lean a little bit more towards those equivalence trials to better understand what's going on now. I think just in the interest of time, I'll skip over some of this because it's just things that we've all talked about for years, and you can read more about it in the chapter as well. But one of the things I wanted to highlight was, I think because we've done a lot of these comparison trials, or horse race trials, they're sometimes called, and a lot of the time we haven't seen just real consistent differences amongst treatments. So we sort of have that finding, and then you have the pandemic happening, and I think there's just continues to be a rise in interest, less in exactly which treatment you're providing, but how we get the treatment to people that need it, and the ways in which we can use things like technology and that sort of stuff. And so we're going to highlight in a minute just the notion of implementation research and the role that psychotherapy researchers can play in improving that. So why don't we move on from here?
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so a couple, these are things that weren't included in the chapter. These are things that we've been thinking more about in the couple years since the chapter was started. And I just wanted to highlight two different approaches. One is more of a theoretical model, and then one specific design approach for optimizing treatment packages. And in a way, this is sort of moving beyond the horse race notion and thinking about ways that we can make our existing treatments more effective in different ways. So the first one I'll mention is the multi-phase optimization strategy, the MOST framework. This is largely based on Linda Collins' work, and really takes inspiration from methods that are used in engineering to improve the efficiency and cost effectiveness of engineering and production lines and so forth. And then one specific trial design that can be used within this framework is the SMART, or sequential multiple assignment randomized trials. And this design can be used to develop adaptive interventions that vary based on how somebody is doing over the course of time. So the idea is that, as you'll see in a slide, that one would optimize one's intervention and potentially using a design like a SMART, and then eventually test it in an efficacy or effectiveness trial, testing it out in the real world, but that we would have this whole optimization phase that happens before. So here's a figure from Linda Collins' book. And as you can see, there are these three phases. The first phase being the preparation phase, where you're really focusing on your conceptual model, identifying exactly what you want to optimize. Do you want the treatment to work more quickly? Do you want it to be less expensive? Do you want it to be less burdensome for therapists or for patients, or more acceptable for a particular cultural group? And then you have this optimization phase, where you're building your optimized intervention through a variety of different experimental designs. And one of the ones that I'll mention is the SMART design. So this is the sequential multiple assignment randomized trial. You'll see example in a second. And then based on results from these optimization trials, you might go back and refine your conceptual model, kind of go back to the preparation phase, continue to optimize, and might kind of cycle back and forth until you feel that the intervention has been optimized adequately to be sufficiently effective to use Linda's language here. And then ultimately, you would test that in a randomized controlled trial. And I think if we look across the history of psychotherapy, as Scott was saying, most of our work has been in this evaluation phase. We don't necessarily spend as much time in these preparation and optimization phases, potentially to our detriment. So to use one example of optimization, and this is optimization in particular of an adaptive intervention. So to orient you, this is a figure from a recent paper, protocol paper for a trial for different ways to augment buprenorphine. Oh my, I shouldn't have picked a word that I'm not as comfortable saying. Buprenorphine and naloxone with different kinds of behavioral support. So you have this first level randomization where someone's randomized to contingency management or a behavioral intervention that's augmented with mindfulness and substance-free reinforcement and motivational interviewing, this BSM portion. And this is our typical trial, right? We do just one randomization, but in the SMART design, there's a second randomization that happens in particular based on how somebody's responding to treatment. And in this case, as you can see, for those who are non-adherent to the medications later in treatment, they're randomized to either switch completely to contingency management or have contingency management added on to the behavioral therapies that they're already receiving, and then the flip for the contingency management first group. And in a way, this is really, I think, an elegant design that can be used to determine whether one should start with one of these and then augment in this way, or start with the other and augment in this other way. And ultimately, you could learn from this trial, it really is best to start with contingency management and then augment in this way, and have this kind of more of a precision medicine or adaptive approach based on a trial design. The factorial designs also, where you can randomize people to multiple initial components, is another really powerful way to, as far as I understand, with the same sample size, be able to answer multiple scientific questions. So this is something I've been getting really excited about and thinking about ways to include in our work. And I do think to some extent it's a cultural shift where we're used to these the traditional RCTs where there are just two groups. So really wrapping our heads, I think, collectively around how we can include multiple forms of randomization, what the impact of that is on statistical power and p-value correction and so forth. But I do think it's a really powerful way to optimize our treatments and ultimately, hopefully, produce treatments that are more effective. So that's the little teaser on SMART. And then this is the little teaser. There aren't any words on this slide because at least I don't have any particular expertise in implementation science, but I know it's really a field that's rising in prominence really quickly. I think they have some beautiful conceptual models that are super relevant to the work that we do. And in a way, I think this is a really fantastic response to some of the sort of dodo bird-ish findings. If all treatments are equally effective, then the question becomes how we can get them out in the world. And I think the implementation science folks are taking that really seriously and doing some super exciting work in that area. Okay.
All right. So as we divided our chapter up, we kind of have the measurement section and then evaluating treatment packages sort of in an absolute efficacy sort of sense and relative efficacy sense, and then the general idea of how does psychotherapy work and understanding the process of change. And we talked about some historical studies that are dismantling studies. You don't see these used as much, partly because they're expensive and it's pretty hard to power them, but they're basically the idea of taking a treatment package. And so the one I like to use is the Jacobson et al. 1996 study, where they took cognitive therapy and they divided it into three conditions. And one was a behavioral activation only condition. A second one was behavioral activation plus the cognitive. It's basically the automatic thoughts challenging. And then the full cognitive therapy, which included the other two components plus the schema work that's kind of comes later in cognitive therapy. And the idea there, right, is to find out whether there are differences. Do you need all the parts? And if you've never read that paper, I think it's a really nice paper to really also articulate sort of the theory of change or the process of change that could occur in any one of those conditions, and how they're kind of all mixed together in a full cognitive therapy treatment. And it's an interesting study, and it's sort of the genesis for behavioral activation being a standalone treatment for depression and things like that. Like I say, it's not used a ton anymore. It never really has been used a lot, but there are the ones out there, and primary problem is just we're really talking about small differences between the conditions, and so it's really going to be hard to have a big enough study to detect significant effects, if there really are any different ones. Obviously, as a consequence, the more common approach to treating or dealing with process outcome relationships is to do an observational study. So standard alliance studies that have been done for decades, where you measure the alliance somewhere early in treatment and compare it to outcome at the end of treatment. What we're seeing more now are cross-like panel models. I saw Frederick on the call. He's done a number of these, where you're looking at doing something. We can use alliance, but you could use any process you're interested in, where you're measuring the alliance multiple times over the course of the therapy, and then the outcome that you're interested in multiple times over therapy, and allowing them to influence one another over time in a panel model. And there's now a whole literature on how to appropriately specify these panel models, and lots of debate about what's the appropriate way to do that. And we point in the chapter towards some of that. Bottom line is sort of your traditional panel model is probably not the best way to deal with it, because it confounds some key things about sort of stable things at the person level and session to session change. And typically we want to separate those things. Then last, just back to the need for variability. I think really my main point here is just the idea of if we're repeatedly asking somebody something, they are human and often will just start checking boxes, or maybe not take the time they need to, and that can create either too much variability because it's a lot of noise, or a lot of range restriction. So sometimes when you're looking through these data, you'll see that people always just mark 4, right? They just kind of mark them 4 all the way along, and that's something you want to investigate and make sure you're paying attention to as you're doing these kinds of studies. As we're studying process versus outcome, your mediation and moderation analyses are your workhorses. They're your sort of main frameworks for thinking about things. On the left-hand side of the screen, you've got sort of your standard mediation model. That's a pretty simple one. The idea that cognitive therapy works by changing dysfunctional schema. And as the schema change, then the depressive symptoms will come down. So the mediation path is A and then B to the end. And that's your indirect path. There's a whole huge literature on mediation that far extends what's been done in sort of the social sciences. It brings in statistics, like the discipline of statistics, computer science, even some philosophy, because it's a lot about causal inference. And it can get pretty complicated pretty fast. But the main idea here is really what we want to know is, as the thing early in the path, in this case, cognitive therapy, as that changes, do the things later on change, and what could be other explanations for that? And then there's some specific ways to compute your standard errors for that A through B path, which is called the indirect effect. And most of our structural equation modeling software will allow us to do that through, you typically bootstrap it. If you use M+ as an example, it's really a trivially easy thing to be able to just have happen with one command. I'm going to skip the effect size thing. It's in the chapter. But that one of the hardest things with determining whether a bottom line is, the bottom line is that one of the hardest things for determining whether an indirect effect is important is its size. And they just tend to be really small. And so sometimes they're significant, but it's sort of like, did that matter at all? And that work is aimed at trying to give a easily computable effect size that you can use. And that V it's defined in the chapter, and you can compute it pretty easily. The other idea of moderation is understanding not just the pathway through which it works, but the context in which different therapy works. And so it's a question I have as a clinician pretty regularly right now, just as I have sort of a mixture in my own private practice of in-person therapy and telehealth and those sorts of things, and really trying to understand when I'm effective and when I'm not. And that would really be a moderation question. And then what we've got here on the right-handed side is this idea of what's sometimes called mediated moderation or moderated mediation, depending on which direction you're going. And that's just the idea that, yeah, maybe you have a mediated path, but it only happens under certain contexts for certain kinds of problems or in certain parts of the therapy and that sort of thing. The thing I want to highlight here for our chapter, since we couldn't get into the details of how each of these analyses work and that sort of thing, is just the idea that the statistical and methods literature often gets way ahead of where we practically are at as researchers. And it can often, I just refer to it as sort of like the siren call of the methodological sophistication, because I like it as much as anybody else. I see this new model I can apply to data. And then I just want to encourage people to be pretty deliberate about applying it and just be thoughtful about whether your data can actually do it, if the study was designed to explore it, that sort of thing. Otherwise, I think we can end up just kind of confusing ourselves as we go along. So,
and just one sidebar, I don't know if folks have seen the Andrew Hayes process macros available in R now. So there's other ways to get the Bootstrap CIs and other similar things in outside of M+2.
Another topic that's near and dear to me, just because I've spent a lot of time writing about it, is just the idea of clustering effects in psychotherapy. And lots of psychotherapy, in fact, most of it historically, and outside of computer-delivered ones now, even whether it's telehealth or not, is still clustered, meaning you have therapists seeing multiple patients or patients within psychotherapy groups and those sorts of things. And you also have clustering over time with observations within patients. And one of the interesting things is just the idea of how do we understand sort of the different effects. So the alliance could have an effect at the therapist level. It could have an effect within the therapist level, or excuse me, within therapists at the patient level. Or adherence would be the same thing, where somebody adhering to a treatment manual, for example, does it matter if the therapist is somebody who is adherent over many patients, or does it just matter how adherent that person is to the particular patient they are seeing, that sort of thing. And multi-level models in their various forms are good machinery for being able to separate out these things. I also think there's interesting conceptual questions that come up when you start thinking about between-within relationships. And one of them that we mentioned in the chapter is the idea of group cohesion. And so you could think of giving a small group of, say, 8 patients a measure of group cohesion, and then doing that over many groups. And one of the interesting questions is how much do the groups at the group level, so if you average the groups, do they differ from one another? So this is sort of similar to the range restriction question. In other words, is much of the variability at the group level, meaning the groups are differently cohesive? So some aren't very cohesive, some are very cohesive. Or is most of the variability within a group, meaning some people feel like the group is cohesive versus some don't? Because the way we talk about it, often when we talk about group theory and why groups change, is we would think about the group as a whole operating. But if most of our variability is at the within group level, meaning the groups are kind of roughly equivalent on average, then most of the differences are amongst the patients within groups. That's a sort of a different scenario. That's more of an individual level measure or construct than it is a group one. So sort of thinking about those differences, I think, are an important part of just thinking about how psychotherapy works, what's most important, and what do we want to pay attention to. This even matters. We talk about this in our as in our clinical psychology PhD program here, just kind of thinking about often, is it a question of can these student therapists create good working relationships with their clients? And is it the case that there are really people who, like, how often do we see somebody who just never does versus somebody who always does? So how much of it is really a therapist differences versus how much of it's more at the dyadic level and it's the particular therapist combined with a particular client, those sorts of things. And so anyway, those are, I think, interesting questions for thinking about everything from how therapy works to training to feedback we give and supervision and stuff like that. So. Do you want, Simon, do you want to, since we just have 15 minutes, why don't we just power, like, bottom line is, like every other discipline, we've been underpowered and we need to do better about that. Do you want to just skip ahead to the pre-registration stuff?
Sure. I think I really love your point about how power can influence our estimates. I don't know if you want to take a minute on this slide.
Sure. So often we talk about power as like what it means is we won't get a significant effect. But the other consequence of that, and that's true, right? Like if you have low power, your probability of rejecting the null is low. But the other issue that comes largely from the idea, at least that I became familiar with it, was from a statistician named Andrew Gelman. And his point is that the other consequence of low power is you get noisy estimates. And what's up on the screen is a type of funnel plot. And basically what I want you to like pay attention to is that as you go from bottom to top, that's the power of a study for a given sample size. Okay, and so when sample size is really low, power is pretty low. And then as you go up, then in sample size, then power gets better. And so you see that as you go up the funnel, as sample size gets bigger, then you get a tighter funnel, which means from sample to sample or study to study, you won't see as much variability. There are two dashed lines, one that's gray, one that's light gray, one that's dark gray. The light gray is just at 0 for an anchor. The dark gray is a population value. So, and that's the alliance outcome correlation from meta-analyses, 0.28. And I think the key thing to just notice is that when sample sizes are small, the only way you're going to get a significant effect, which are the triangles that are dark, is if the effect is really large. And so if you combine sort of our practice of largely only publishing significant effects and you have really small samples, we're going to end up with overestimates that are going to consistently be above the mean. And even if you get into middle power, so in the middle of the graph there, you still have a lot of effects that are below the mean, but that aren't that wouldn't be detected as statistically significant. And so you still have a fair bit of noise, especially when you combine it with the significance filter. And so one of the idea here is that when you're just going to end up, this is the publication bias problem, but sort of layering power on top of it, of the way in which power influences that, and why we end up with a biased literature if we don't have sufficient power. And so we mentioned that, you know, we can, if you only meta-analyze published studies, that actually doesn't help, because you're still only going to catch the ones that have passed that significance threshold, or they're going to be biased toward that, even if some of the null effects are in there. Though I would say in the last 5 years, you've seen an improvement both in power of studies as well as our willingness to publish non-significant effects. So.
Yeah. So Craig has a question.
Oh.
To what extent might lower powered studies contribute to the attenuation effect? Early studies with larger effect size than subsequent later studies.
I think that's a great point, and I think that that's a common issue, right? Like if you look at, there's, what's it called?
The beginner's luck?
Analysis. Yeah. It's called the cumulative plot. I think it's basically like a plot where you accumulate the evidence, but you start it with year. So you're doing it across time. So you go to the original studies and then move forward. And if you do that with at least the meta-analyses I've done myself, so behavioral marital therapy is an example of one of those. Neil Jacobson's original studies done in the late 70s had these massive effects, Ds of 1.5 and 2 and that sort of thing. But then but they're also really small studies. And as you got bigger studies over time, you saw exactly what you talked about, Craig, in your comment, which is they attenuate and regress back to the mean is what I assume is happening most of the time. So. But yeah, that's been shown in other disciplines. Medicine's the same way with their pharmacology studies. So,
yeah, I've heard that. I've heard it called beginner's luck. That
yeah,
you get it, but maybe it is just a power thing. And then this slide is basically reiterating what Scott's point about meta-analysis. You know, often I think we look to that as a way of getting more reliable estimates, and of course testing moderators. But if we're meta-analyzing biased effect size estimates, then we end up with a bias omnibus effect size too. Just one other point to make about meta-analysis that we didn't talk about in the chapter, but folks have probably heard of or done some of themselves, which we think are exciting, are using network meta-analysis to test indirect comparisons. And this is a figure from one of Pim Kuiper's recent World Psychiatry papers. And then also testing patient-level moderators using individual patient data, and we're seeing a lot more of that, which really, I think, ties in with some of the comments we wanted to make about open science, too, because collaboration can be a huge part of that as well. So to motivate some of the open science, the second elephant we wanted to bring into the room, or name in the room, is that we have a bit of a replication problem. And this is something there's been a lot of discussion about for the past 10 years or so, I would say. One of the splashier papers that came out on this was published in 2015 in the journal Science. And in this study, they tried to replicate 100 psychological studies that had been published in high-impact psychology journals. 97% of them had significant results. And you can see the distribution of effect sizes from those studies here in blue. And then the significance is, or that was for the significant studies, and the non-significant studies are there in pink. And then these two curves are the attempted replications. And as you can see, the distributions look really quite different. And many of the replications were not significant in pink there. Obviously, many of them had effect sizes that were much closer to 0 and much smaller than the original study. So this has been, it kind of started with social psychology in a way, but has been spreading to other disciplines. And in a way, my hope is that this is kind of coming for us in a way, and this is stuff that we're taking seriously. So we wanted to just mention a few reasons why this replication problem exists to really motivate the movement towards open science. The short answer is that for a long time, and I will raise my hand and acknowledge that I was trained as a graduate student and have certainly published papers using what we might term as questionable research practices. And in a way, these are different ways that we rely on opportunistic bias, or biases that are related in a sense to conducting lots of tests and buying lots of lottery tickets and cashing the ones that are winning lottery tickets. You can also see this, they've used the term harking or hypothesizing after the results are known. So you write a hypothesis section, but you'd already analyzed the data. And in a way, it wasn't a true hypothesis in the sense that it was a priori These are all kind of flavors of p-hacking and are related to the fact that frequently, and I think frequently in psychotherapy research in particular, we have a large degree of analytic flexibility. And this, of course, is coupled with what have historically been incentives in our field where it's harder to publish null findings, as Scott said, and I totally agree. It's getting a little bit easier, especially when we're pre-registering. I don't know if funders have gotten more open to funding null findings. I think that might be a little bit harder to change opinions on, but there are reasons why we engage in these questionable research practices.
So we were just, it was interesting when we wrote this, the initial draft. I remember Michael Barkham just was like, but isn't flexibility a good thing? And so we kind of went back and forth in terms of, we definitely are not trying to, as therapists, we typically want people to be a little more flexible than they've been and that sort of thing. And I think the idea here is, in the end, I think a lot of the pre-registration and the notions of open science is primarily the kind of ideal is transparency, is just an understanding of what we did and when we did it and when the decisions were made and those sorts of things, so that the community of scientists and frankly any decision maker or stakeholder can evaluate it reasonably. So we added the term problematic just to emphasize what we think are things that can lead us kind of in the wrong direction sometimes. So here are 5 things we raised. I'm sure there are others that could be relevant in psychotherapy research. One is just what's an agreed upon definition of change. Is it the rate one changes over a period of time? Is it the pre-post difference? That sort of thing. Inclusion, exclusion criteria. I think this really shows up primarily, or it could be pretty obvious in naturalistic data analysis. And by that, what I mean is you're using data sets that are collected as part of routine care. You often get these massive data sets. And you do have to decide who gets to go in and who doesn't, right? Because not everybody's going to in that database you get is going to provide the information you need to answer your question. But it's pretty easy to just sort of make decisions kind of along the way. And lots of the time, frankly, you're just guessing, or at least I do anyway. You're just sort of trying to make the best guess or you can about what constitutes a treatment dose or something like that. Or if they've been out of therapy for 90 days, does that mean it's over? Is it just 30 days and that sort of thing? So you're just trying to make the best decisions you can. And again, I think transparency is your most important thing. What you don't want to do, though, is find out your results and then start adding and dropping people to see if things change and then not report that you did that. That's the key thing. It's the not reporting part that ends up being the problem and can mislead us. Testing unplanned interactions, especially, again, and not labeling them correctly or at least transparently as exploratory is pretty important. And then missing data, that's just missing data is always a difficult problem. And then basing the decisions on missing data on how they impact the results. So we can, the tricky thing with questionable research practices is we can usually come up with a very rational, reasonable reason for our decision. And so that's the importance of transparency and considering alternatives. I think that's super helpful.
And I know I'm looking at the clock. I know we just have 3 minutes. So I thought maybe, Scott, maybe we could just mention how we've been thinking about this. And I'd love to hear from folks on the call how other people have. But again, to underscore that really the primary medicine in a way is pre-registration. We're hoping that the sugar will be that we can justify deviations and it might increase publishability by pre-registering our studies. Mentioned collaboration and again, making things transparent and doing that ahead of time. So we've been doing this in our own work. I think it's easier in a way for randomized trials when you can register primary, secondary, and mechanism hypotheses and make your data available. I think it does get a little bit trickier with naturalistic data. Some of the things to acknowledge that are drawbacks are the time and effort that this can take, and actually having to do the hard thinking before you run your study about what you're hoping to find. But I've really appreciated it. Scott and I have done this with a couple data sets, and it's been helpful to have those conversations ahead of time. And Jock, I totally agree to the adversarial collaboration point as well. So yeah, IRB issues related to this, but maybe I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen, and we can just have a minute to have folks share any approaches that they've been using. Let's see.
And I think we'd welcome any conversation people want to have about other topics that we raised as well, if that's up.
In 60 seconds.
Yeah.
Are people doing this? Or I'm sure many of you are.
Sorry, don't worry about the 60 seconds. People will walk when they've had enough. So don't box yourself in. No. And just if there's no immediate questions, can I just go back to the Linda Collins slide, your SMART, which seems a really neat way of speeding up trials. It's the idea I was always taught was, trials are like super tankers. You start and then it takes forever to stop and you can't change anything. Whereas this is a much more adaptive kind of approach. But I was just slightly challenged by the power. When you've got folks such as Pim talking about, we should only be doing trials with N's of 500 or more, given the propensity for small effects, which, you raised, then, that trial has got 240. So it seems to me sort of questionably underpowered to start with, let alone then all the, what effect size are you taking into consideration when you're, so it seems like you've got multiple potential effects to establish base power on. So how do you get around, because you said, that actually it was powered sufficiently to do 101, well, not quite 101, but and any number of the analyses. Can you just sort of clarify that a bit?
Yeah, my understanding, Michael, and there are folks at the University of Michigan, Billy Nahumshani and Danny Almirall, who are doing a lot of work, and they're methodologists working a lot in this area. But my understanding is that basically you power for any particular comparison, but you don't magically end up with more people, but you can kind of slice the data in different ways where you're combining across groups that, say, had certain features in effect. If we take a factorial design as a simple example, groups that both received a certain feature, even if within that group they didn't receive a second feature, you can kind of combine in different ways that allow you at least to use your data more efficiently. But I agree, that's a question I've had. I don't know that, if you're planning on detecting a small effect, there's no way around it. You need a large sample, as far as I understand it.
Yeah. No, I totally take the idea of being more efficient within it, but I still come back to the bottom line that 240 basically just seems underpowered for a standard trial. Full stop.
And they might be making the argument that if the effect size is smaller than that, then it's not important enough to optimize for. But yeah.
Oh, we could have an argument here.
Yeah.
Okay. No, thanks. Appreciate that. But I do appreciate, because I know, just for folk listening here, that when you wrote the chapter, I know that certainly Scott really wanted to front the chapter with the transparency and the open science thing. So I take responsibility for the fact that it flipped to the end. So, but it was never an underestimation of its importance in some ways. I think it was more a way of enabling people to access in and lead up to the killer point at the end. But it does seem to me to be so important now to have And I think the transparency is the key word here. I think that's, how can we go wrong with transparency? Just seems patently obvious, really.
Well, we will open more questions, right? Is this from the audience? Is there, because I really liked also these smart trials, this whole idea, because I think that all our average comparisons is kind of limited in a way. I'm not sure if we even need to replicate the zero findings, that there is no average difference in a way. So I think the smart trials is really something to move forward, especially for those cases which do not make progress yet with our treatments. But I have a little bit a different question. I mean, I like the whole open science idea, and for the naturalistic samples, I mean, we just tried now to build up a little bit a European consortium to exchange data from a naturalistic point of view. But one of the big problems is that everybody uses different measures, and that's, so the whole, there will be actually a new research area somehow to link existing data to each other. I mean, by doing some kind of linkage by factor models, whatever, IRT, item response models, and so on. So that's an issue which is interesting. And the other, which I really liked from your talk, is the issue about new measures. So that was actually my first, and actually this is the question I have to you, if you might give, because new measures is like we do, I think in the future with the machine learning and the big data issue with text analysis, we'll have soon new measures in a way, building based on, I mean, we're just starting to transcribe a lot of our videotapes. And I was wondering if we build those new measures, or these based on our old rating systems, with now the new transcribed machine learning, don't we come into the danger that we just redo the same thing? You know, the rating systems, they must just be rebuilt. And I like the issue around the therapeutic alliance, you know, when it's skewed in a way. And are we able now to, or do you have any recommendations for this new step in developing new measures and technology-based measures, maybe on transcripts or text analysis or other kinds of measures, to avoid this problem of really skewed distributions? You have any ideas or suggestions for these new developments in doing measures? Because we try to cross-validate these with the old measures, right? In the end, in a way, come to the same results. And anyway.
Do you want to take that? I actually, unfortunately, have to hop off for another meeting in a second, but I'd love to hear your answer.
Well, I don't know that I have a good one, though. I think that's a really interesting question, and the one of the things that, maybe this is exactly what you just said, but one of the things that the scope of data that you might be now dealing with that we wouldn't have in the past is it gives you a different view, which could affect your theory about the construct in the first place. And so I believe that fundamentally the measurement and our theory and definitions and those sorts of things we're only going to be ever as good as those are going to be, right? Like if those aren't any good, then they're not going to be very good. So I don't think replicating what we've done all the time is going to be a good thing unless we're convinced that truly is like rock solid foundation, which I think I don't know that anybody would say that about things like the Alliance or Outcome or anything like that. I think we'd have lots that we could do to improve that. So I would say absolutely I'd be supportive intellectually of the notion of like, why don't we rethink even some of the fundamental things if the data suggests that. So
okay, sorry, I'm aware that Simon needs to hop off, and we can carry on, but I'd like to thank Simon particularly for his contribution. We will carry on until everyone walks out, but huge thanks to you, Simon.
Yeah,
and
thanks.
We'll be in touch.
Yeah,
and will you be in Dublin?
Unfortunately,
Will you be in
not.
Dublin?
My wife is having a baby, so I'll be a new parent hopefully this summer. So,
Okay, well, I hope all goes well. But huge thanks to you.
And just one last thought, because I can't resist. Wolfgang, one possibility is we might be able to build models that instead of having an intermediary variable that we're predicting, we're building the model using the transcript to predict outcomes, for example, or using passive data to predict. So we can kind of cut out the middle person, maybe.
I like to discuss this further, actually, because we play around with these kind of ideas right now, too. And excellent. Excellent. And thanks a lot for your talk. Wonderful talk.
Yeah, good to see you all. Have a great conversation. Okay.
See you in Ottawa.
Okay.
See you, latest in Ottawa. So are there more questions? No.
Okay.
We've hit the saturation point.
Well, I mean, I just found it really, I mean, it feels to me like we can never have enough of this because it just keeps you kind of going and thinking and refreshing, and you pick up, and I picked up a number of points I want to kind of pursue. You might get an email from me. So, you know, and I think that's what we all need. In the end, we're all, whatever our interest, we're all methodologists. Otherwise we shouldn't be here. So, you know, I think this is absolutely brilliant, and may we have more of it, please. So huge thanks, Juice. Go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say what I liked about, like, as I think about Wolfgang raising that issue, is some of the most interesting innovations will come from actually having to solve a real problem, not just sort of, I love my methodologist colleagues. You know, I consider myself a methodologist, but I think sometimes we're solving problems to solve a problem, as opposed to, I think, a situation like what you're talking about, which is that there is a real deal thing you're interested in trying to figure out, and we gotta come up with a rigorous way to deal with that. That's where good stuff comes, and so good conversations to have, for sure.
Right. Well, many thanks to you, Scott. It's lovely to see you.
Likewise.
And hopefully one day we will collaborate.
Indeed. Yes. We're getting there. As soon as my life. Anyway, I should stop saying as soon as my life gets easier, but it's just going to be what it is. So.
Yeah. Anyway, lovely to see you. Thank you, especially to Juan for all his coordination.
Yes,
Wouldn't be
thank you
possible
so much.
without you. And hopefully we will see folk at the next webinar, which is in May the 30th, and it's Sarah Knox and Clara Hill on supervision training, which will be a wonderful complement. That's the whole idea of these, is to mix and match so no one gets bored. Cool. Okay, lovely.
Thank you.
Huge thanks to everybody. Thank you.
Thank
Cheers.
you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.